Grayson Perry had a great analogy for masculinity. He sees it rather like woodwork. For some men it's essential, for some men it's a nice hobby, and for some men they really just don't need it. Hello and welcome to Fox Reviews. In the last video we discussed with Piers Morgan Fox Now on non-binary identities. It was really focused on the interview. In this video I really want to take it from a different angle, because I think there's wider things within the trans community and within society as a whole which have a bearing on what's being discussed. I don't hold the opinion that necessarily the societal views of gender are always correct or indeed beneficial. Piers Morgan displayed concern about breaking these gender rules and what the implications may be, and also I do think suppressed trans and non-binary as a minority issue, that it doesn't applicable to most people. However, I see traditional views as something that affects everybody, regardless if you identify as someone on the transgender spectrum or not, and furthermore can be potentially very harmful. Young people, especially, not exclusively, are more openly talking about politics with a small p, with gender being one of those focuses, what it means to have a gender and those wider ramifications. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a deeper discussion on this. I've compiled a number of clips from other sources to kind of give you a variety of what people are discussing. Now, in the description below, I will have all the links of all the videos I've used as source material. So if you want to go and watch those, I welcome you watch as many as you feel you want to, so you get a good spread of what's being discussed. Just a brief aside note, this is a fourth edit of the video. There's been a few clips I have unfortunately not been able to get up onto YouTube itself. The links are still all down below, but for the clips I haven't been able to include, I've just gone over the key points. What I would like to do to begin is just to give you two examples of how I perceive gender in society as creating potential harm. The first set of clips I used was from Grayson Perry, discussing macho men. This actually features on Loose Women, discussing the lack of expression from males and the societal view that men don't express emotions, therefore they bottle them up and making them numb. This highlighted then was a serious issue with having high suicide risks in younger to 30-year-old men especially. The second was from an Ellen interview, which was discussing gender and image, specifically in this example, but I don't believe not exclusively, to females pertaining to needing to look a certain way, and of course you have magazines reinforcing those images and that particular body type, which is unattainable. Even by the magazine's own admission, they are fantasy images. But the point that she developed from this was actually it is the wrong focus entirely, that we're placing too much emphasis on these unrealistic goals, which was then having knock-ons onto people maybe working out excessively, bulimia, eating disorders, and general health and well-being being heavily negatively impacted by these social norms. These are just two examples where the suppression of expression or the upholding and enforcement of certain standards can create a lot of harm. Now, with both these topics, you could easily make a whole video on them, and obviously I don't really want to focus too much on that here because I want to move on to the discussion of non-binary identities. But this just is a very brief illustration of how significant the social expectations are on how we perceive and how we interact within our own gender identity. Within society, we actively choose to either reinforce or redefine these social standards around us, and by no means are they always the default or the status quo we have to adhere to. It's just often the safe and well-worn path. Now, the big limitation with these traditional quote-unquote social norms is that these don't really fit people. They're shorthands, as I said in my labels video I've done before. And as you can see, these expressions don't always fit what is actually in the world around us and the variance you have within it. To set the scene here, I'm going to do a brief video clip just explaining the key concepts around gender. This clip was taken from a much larger video discussing all different aspects of the trans umbrella. For anyone who's curious, I strongly recommend that you watch it because it does cover a lot of different aspects. But the key 3 points I wanted to cover here was the difference between biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression, with biological sex being the physical genitalia and chromosomes, so that's your physical body, where you have gender identity, which is your mental presentation, so whether you feel like you're more masculine or more feminine, and of course the non-binaries fit in between these two, with expression being a bit more nuanced, with a mixture of expression. For example, your physical gender may be female, your gender identity may be male, but your expression may have some, what we might call in society, female components. For example, you might like to wear makeup, or, for example, wear flowers in your hair from time to time. So rather than having a definite male or female, you may have a blend of those. Now, this is going to highlight the different concepts we're discussing around gender, and there's different layers to this discussion. And of course then this will then roll into what I'm going to discuss next. After the initial interview with Piers Morgan, Fox and Owl discussing gender non-binary, it highlighted a split in the community from a more welcoming, progressive, liberal perspective and a much more protectionist, traditional, conservative perspective. And what I saw was very much a wanting to cut off of conversation and more a hand waving or a dismissal that, oh no, non-binaries don't exist because they are not truly trans, or you're not listening to us, we have a different perspective of what we perceive gender to be. See, I thought it'd be interesting to look at this in a little more detail. Certainly going to be very controversial to cover these topics, but I do think it has to be stated because the trans umbrella is very wide. So you're going to have different people in it with different points of view. 3 key concepts I want to cover. The first is the difference between gender and sex.
The main thing I hear people cite to deny our existence is science. They say that you either have male parts or female parts. As someone who genuinely loves science, it sucks to see people trying to use it to erase the existence of others, especially when there is plenty of science to suggest the opposite. Sex is biological and has to do with your anatomy and physiology. Gender, on the other hand, is a socially constructed set of cultural norms. These general definitions are not made-up Tumblr fantasies. You'll find a similar distinction made by the World Health Organization, the American Psychological Association, the University of Monash, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission, just to name a few organizations. And while some people want to believe that sex and gender have the exact same meaning, that understanding is inconsistent both with all of the sociological research done today.
The true number of genders, 2. We're going to have to agree on one solid foundation, which is that gender is not a social construct. It is different than sex in that gender is a word used to describe differences between the sexes and the roles that they fill, but it's not socially constructed. It's almost entirely biological. Humans are a sexually dimorphic species, and gender roles as they manifest in women and men represent measurable differences in behaviors between the sexes.
Now, as you can see in the 2 clips that I've used, there is very much a distinction between gender and identity and the argument where they're just the same. Now, there's a lot of big variance in that expression of those identities. What I find from the more traditional perspective, they seem to want to bind them together one for one, as there can be no real variance from it. If there is any variance, there's going to be very minor, and that's where they get their dismissive in perspective, where from what I've seen of society, human beings are just more diverse than that. To say that, oh no, there's just this very small niche of what it is to be male and to be female is somewhat reductionistic in its approach, which is kind of what was discussed by the first set of clips that was used. Now, in the second set of clips, sex and gender identity not matching was covered.
So if we can agree that sex and gender are different, then we should be able to agree that your gender and the sex you were assigned at birth might not match according to what our societal norms would have you believe. So someone born with a penis could be non-binary, or someone born with a vagina could be a man. There is an infinite set of sexes and an infinite set of genders, and they can combine in any way. There's nothing innate that would force people to identify with their assigned sex, especially because social and cultural cultural norms for genders vary so widely from culture to culture. Of course, some people argue that being trans is just a mental illness, which allows them to pretend that trans identities are not valid. But this claim isn't based on any factual evidence. One study found that being trans isn't a mental illness because it doesn't inherently cause suffering. It's people's mistreatment of trans people that causes suffering. Even organizations that do call it a mental illness have begun to change their definitions. Remember, being gay used to be considered a mental illness. It wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. And the same thing happened with gender identity disorder in 2012. The APA now calls it gender dysphoria and treats it more like a variation of human experience rather than a mental illness.
Portion of the population that are transsexuals, such as yours truly. I'm a biological male who was born that way and will die that way. However, as my luck would only have it, Mother Nature gave me the inclinations of a female. Because of that, I decided to take it upon myself to seek out the help of medicine to transition or physically resemble the body of a woman to the best of my ability.
As you can see here from the video clips being used, there is a difference in what is discussed regarding gender not matching and the treatment of that. So obviously you've got the very traditional perspective where you're just going from one gender to another, and that's the only valid form of expression, to having we are not matching, therefore you're going to open up that expression. But when you actually look into deeper detail around research and around gender expression, there seems to be a lot more variant than first is being explored here. Now, in this last set of clips, we'll cover non-binary gender identities.
If you can recognize that gender is just this arbitrary social construct that's not based in biology, and you can recognize that people don't have to identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, then why can't they identify with a gender that's not strictly man or woman? There's no clear biological basis to our made-up social concepts of masculinity and femininity. There's no hard and fast line between our ideas of men and women. It's really not that hard to imagine that someone could identify with bits of both, or neither. There are tons of non-binary people out there telling you that we exist and explaining how we feel. One study published in early 2016 in the International Review of Psychiatry found that there are a significant number of people who identify outside of the gender binary. Such non-binary gender identity or expression has been present over time and across different global cultures. Non-binary people might appear to be a relatively recent and under-researched phenomenon, but it is likely that some people who previously would have identified as trans within the gender binary may have identified outside of the binary if that discourse had been available to them. Neuroscientific research even shows that there's no such thing as a male or female brain, and our brain biology exists on a spectrum. And if you want the authority of a large organization, the World Health Organization says that different gender identities don't necessarily fit into binary male or female sex categories.
Genderqueer, agender, gray gender, genderless. You are free to identify as anything you'd like. I'm not here to regulate thoughts. I'm simply here to regulate this false premise that it's valid in any other setting other than inside of your own head. Not one of these new genders of the week are scientifically valid. I mean, there's nothing to measure them with.
Now you can see from these last set of clips, discussing around the presence of non-binary and having the word to describe them. There's definitely been some historical reports of the people expressing what we might consider now non-binary perspectives, but maybe we didn't just have the words at the time to express them. And maybe this is where you're coming in from the protectionist perspective of, well, these are just new labels, they just appeared recently, obviously they're just a new fad. But the non-binary community are very much making their mark on their identity, saying that this is how they identify. And almost by having this refusal of acceptance, it just sharpens their resolve. This is where kind of my perspective comes in. If you can challenge gender identity with not matching your biological gender, therefore you're already challenging that gender norm. So you're actually saying that that's a difference. Therefore, if you're going to make that distinction of a difference, then from that position, you are effectively saying that people can change and have different identities. Therefore, I would personally argue that if that's the case, then what is the issue with having other gender identities, as stated earlier in one of the first clips that I used, where you had the variance in that expression and how things can also not be static or the same. So this is where kind of one of the main controversies coming from, where you have gender non-binary identities And again, you have the dismissive protectionist perspective of hand waving away they just don't exist, minimising gender of the weak, obviously was using one of the comments, to being more open. Well, if you can transition to something else and you are challenging those core societal norms that you have, just men and just women, and they just stay static, then why would non-binary be any different? You would expect there to be different expressions of those identities, where you may find someone that may not feel completely male or completely female, but somewhere in the middle. So for me personally, that seems quite logical that you would have that outcome. As I said in the last video, there is a big desire from the non-binary community to create a conversation about gender identities, and kind of creating this debate, where of course you have the more pedestrian basically saying, well, we don't recognise you, why are you in our community? So very much removing people and just saying, kind of almost calling off what it means to be trans, especially LGBT and bi in the past comes to mind, about how that kind of clashed with those binaries between gay and straight, and how that kind of challenged those perspectives. But of course here you have the non-binaries challenging these traditional norms, and this is what's kind of creating this debate. But where I come to is that you have variance in human beings. I mean, as been said in the research before, and just in general, I mean, the biological component has been argued for why you might transition one to another. But as I said before, you have things like hormone washes, which also then play a role in gender development and that gender expression. So to have a binary yes or no to male or female kind of goes against where the modern research is going regarding transgender and transgender identities and this variance you have in the communities. Kind of in conclusion, really, I see human beings politically, ideologically, socially, all on a spectrum. We have a wealth of diversity within ourselves along a whole load of different axes. So to have such defined restrictive categories seems to go against what it means to be human. At the same time, by transitioning, you are still challenging significantly those perceived gender norms. My birth sex doesn't match my gender identity. Therefore, I want to change to match my gender identity. That's a significant step to make that change and to have that progression. Therefore, by challenging that, for me personally, it does question why you would want to be so restrictive against the non-binary community, because they're just challenging it just in a slightly different way, a slightly different type of expression. I definitely don't think necessarily all trans people need to agree within the community, because we all have our own thoughts and perspectives. But I do think that discussing society, discussing social norms, and gender plays a role in that is important for everybody, as I said at the beginning of the video, not just for the non-binary trans community, but for people as a whole. And I really see how you self-identify, gay, straight, bi, trans, pansexual, grey-gendered, etc., as a very intimate and personal choice. As you discussed with the gender tag, these things are very personal about how we identify and how we feel comfortable as individuals. And with any labels, they're just shorthands, and often they are very reductionistic, so they don't really encompass what it means to be something. It's just a shorthand label. And humans are very complex, and we're a bundle of different things altogether. So you're going to have an interplay between them. So for me, to have a label that just says you are X or Y and then not have very many labels at all, if you want to discuss those, goes against a lot of this variance you have in humanity. If you were to say, for example, I don't accept someone because they claim to be bisexual, people would not agree with that, because it's kind of more kind of openly discussed in society. You don't have to like men or women. You can like both men and women, or you can just see people as people and then just like people. So these kind of personal identities are kind of very innate to us as individuals. And it really kind of comes on to the perspective, I can't speak about other people's experiences. Hence why often I will discuss with other people about how they feel, how they experience the world. And that will enrich myself as a result. I actually really enjoy discussing with other people what their identities are, how they perceive and view things. And sometimes that's changed my view as a result because of what they've said. And because you have this division in the community, there is some people that feel very left out and very isolated. So in the last two clips, I really want to kind of just look at that and question why that exists.
I had no help from the community, and honestly, the only people that made me feel better, legit, were my like cis straight friends. They were the only people who actually made me feel trans. How sad is that I couldn't even get support within the community?
The last clip actually was taken from a video discussing the other aspects of inequality within the LGBT community. Now, what was mentioned here, someone went to a gala dinner featuring the comedian Alan Carr giving a speech. Now, they questioned why the LGBT is the only community that have a desire to cannibalize ourselves. We have real enemies that don't want gay marriage, don't want LGBT equal rights, are against trans equality. And he fundamentally questioned the need why we have to fight against each other. So in terms of this video, having the protectionist viewpoint I don't see as very productive, because all it will do is create a divided group of having non-binaries on one side and then having the true trans, in inverted commas, on the other. Where I see there's a potentially lot of overlap between the two. And if you were to have one group identity representing all those trans aspects, that leads you can approach more battles on different fronts. And I know from quite a lot of the protectionist viewpoints, they say that a lot of the big battles have been won, in inverted commas, and there has been significant gains in those. However, there's still massive inequality in pay, in equal treatment, in hate crime. There's lots of other issues that are still present and still need to be addressed. So to say the whole battle has been won, I believe personally, is a little bit premature. And just from the videos there, it says to me that by being divided, we weaken ourselves as a community. The number of individuals I've spoken to that see it's important to be considered within the transgender umbrella is common. And regardless of what personal beliefs you have, I don't see them disappearing. And I don't really pertain to kind of the ostrich approach, just having your head in the sand, just to say, oh no, they'll go away, they're not real, I don't recognise them, because they're already stating that they are who they are. They've already made that announcement. And I think what's really telling here is they're trying to reach out to have a conversation with people, whether that's within or outside of the community. And I think that's what's really important here, is that I think for society to move forwards, you have to engage with different perspectives. I'm certainly kind of more on the liberal end. So I personally see having diversity in expression is good for humanity as a whole. And I would argue there's lots of research to back up that having acceptance in societies is helpful for everybody and is certainly a lot less costly on society. So to have these discussions cut off creates a great deal of harm for everybody. And to not discuss gender and gender roles is kind of missing some of the issues we have society at the moment. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And please subscribe.